Welcome to the Teen Life Podcast, where we explore your questions to help you make meaningful connections with teenagers, because no teen deserves to feel alone. Have a question you'd like us to address? Email us at podcast@teenlife.ngo. Now, let's jump into this week's question. Should I be worried about the way my teen jokes or talks? This is a big one, and today we're definitely going to talk more generally. We're not gonna get into specifics about what teens should or shouldn't say, but I do think that edgy humor is something that teens definitely lean into. But as we set up this episode, I just want to say a lot of times they're testing boundaries. Right. They're using it in a social context, and it's not necessarily a value statement. I think sometimes as adults, we can read very deep into every single thing that they say and get very offended or be like, this teenager is a horrible person because they just said that.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're using it to experiment with identity, power, belonging, and it's not necessarily a deeply held belief. And when you push them on it, they're like, I don't know, I just said it.
Yeah, I think that might be like a greater issue of like,
Sure.
like, well, are you saying it if you don't believe it? But I think very much across the board, it's just like I'm saying it without much thought. Yes, I'm aware of what it means, but it's like I'm not saying it to mean that. It's just interesting. And I think if you evaluate the history of humankind, we're pushing for edgy jokes, and those get laughs or those get reactions. And I think teens especially are pushing for that. For reactions, if it's from you or from a sense of belonging that these friends think this is funny. These are the jokes that they use, so I'm going to use those as well. And it kind of forms their identity around who am I, what reactions do I get, and what gives me social.
We've done an episode before on identity, so I'll link that. But if you've ever done a psychology class and heard of Erik Erikson, is a big one on this identity formation. And that is one of the major tasks of adolescence. So if you think about what are teenagers going into adolescence to accomplish, one of them is identity. Who am I? What reactions am I going to get? And what does that do for me? And I think that's where this comes into play too of, you already said it, if a joke gets a laugh, then the teen's brain's going, wow, I got a laugh. That's incredible. I'm going to keep doing that because now I'm a funny guy.
Well, it's an endorphin rush.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's a literal science of, I liked that, so I'm going to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that they are watching and listening to are already doing this stuff. Even if you are monitoring what they're doing, there are TV shows that are perfectly fine for teenagers that are going almost all the way to the limit of what they can and can't say and do. So why wouldn't they do the same?
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of the reality of it.
Well, that's why I think we'll talk a little bit more about reactions too, and as an adult, how you can react to this well. Because honestly, I don't think a lot of times we react well, but it can go on either way. It can get a laugh, and so that reinforces it. It can be shocking, and that reinforces, now I'm getting attention because it's shocking. Or maybe it gets super negative reaction, and now my peers are like, oh, I can't believe you said that. And that is once again reinforcing it. I think me and Tobin talked about this, I think at one point off mic. But what is interesting is sometimes it's just low-hanging fruit of like the humor that they're using. Yeah. You're going, as an adult, I'm going, that wasn't even clever or funny. You just pulled out whatever first came to mind or what you heard someone else say that got a reaction. And so sometimes it's just, someone else said this. And so I'm going to belong by saying it also. And so that's where we're talking about, it might not even be this deeply held belief. I don't know. And sometimes they also joke about it in a way to deflect from something else.
I think sarcasm is just teens especially, and I'm very sarcastic. And maybe it's just a trend of just the way that culture is moving. But teens especially, if you're an adult and your teen says something, odds are they're just being sarcastic or kidding. And if you're taking it literally, you're going to have a reaction. And it's just, I can't, it's hard to think of specific examples, but if they're saying things like, I like this or so and so, it's probably a joke to get a reaction or just quite literally a joke.
I know I see it in group. Anytime I do group, that I've had kids before that will literally say something that is borderline inappropriate, probably inappropriate for that setting. And I'm watching them and they're just watching me. Like, I just floated out a little test. How are you going to react to that? How are you going to respond to me saying that? And I do think sometimes we have to also watch that. We talk about being shock proof on this podcast all the time. But sometimes they're watching to see, how are you going to respond to this? And then also sometimes it's just, if a student has very strong language, as in profanity, sometimes to me that is they feel very strongly about this. And if in my mind I immediately go to shut it down, shut it down, shut it down, I'm missing what they're saying and trying to get the heart behind, oh no, something has really upset them, or they feel very like this is unjust. And so I need to be paying attention.
There's a SpongeBob episode where they learn cuss words. It's really funny because like they replace
dolphin noises.
They replace cuss words with dollars, but they call them sentence enhancers, and there is some like truth behind that. Of there are times when I mean, like, we all do this to an extent. We may not be with F-bombs necessarily, but we all have things that we will say that we want when we want to get our point across. And sometimes when you're an adolescent, that's the only way you can. Because, like, think about if you are a 13, 14, 15-year-old, a lot of times you're not even listened to because you're not in control of that. And that's the only way they can get your attention sometimes. And yes, being shock-proof is important, but I would also go as far to say is, like, in a group setting, or if you're a teacher listening, like, it really is a question of what do you really want to pick that battle. Like, if it's egregious and if it's hurtful or it's attacking somebody, that's one thing. But, like, there are times when it's like, is this really the fight that I need to fight right now? Or is there something else behind this that I can maybe speak into? Right. Because that sounds like the conservative parents of mine are twitching a little bit, because they're just like, no, like, when you say a bad word, you get your mouth washed out with soap. That was like, that's the life I grew up in. But there are times when it's like, okay, like, is this really worth potentially harming a relationship that I have with this teenager or whatever it may be, just because they said a word that I don't like or don't want them to say?
Well, let's talk about if, like, looking at the signs of, is it just immaturity? Is it just potentially a teenager being a teenager? Or is there something deeper behind it, and kind of these red flags? So it's probably just immaturity if it happens mostly around peers. If they're doing it when they're around other people who are talking that way.
And I mean, it's a natural human thing. Like, different. I have a friend who, I don't know, he talks, like, whenever he jokes, he, like, talks different. I can't really describe it. But if I'm around him, like, he will talk like Clayton. Like, I will I just change the way that, like, I even, like, form my words, because it's like, I'm around him, he brings out a different side of me, and, like, it's just fun, and we are social. We are created to be social with each other. And yeah, I think, if they're around peers and adopting the way that they're talking or some of the same jokes, I mean, that's normal. I mean, if it is pushing past a boundary, it can be a different conversation. But also, yeah, I mean, temper your reaction of, like, okay, like, yeah, that's normal. It's immaturity if the teen stops when corrected. If it's like, okay, hey, maybe you don't know what this word means. Maybe you don't know what you're communicating to others, to adults especially. Like, whenever you say these things, and I didn't know that, and it stops, and that's probably just immaturity. Or if there's, like, no pattern of cruelty, if it's a one-off thing that you're like, whoa, that's unlike.
Yeah, and I think the red flags in that situation are if it starts becoming a repeated thing that ends up turning into hurtful stuff. Like, if it's dehumanizing, if it's hostile, I mean, we'll say if it's racist, if it's some sort of thing where they think it's funny, but it's actually hurtful. That's obviously a pretty big red flag in that situation. And then if it's also, like, paired with, they're more isolated, or they're more angry, or their behavior is drastically changing, that's one thing. If you're talking about a tirade that may have, like, laced with cuss words and stuff that's happened every once in a while, that's a different setting than if every time you talk to them they're losing their cool, they're getting angry and cussing out the situation. Like, that's a little different. That's a sign of, like, anxiety, depression, whatever it may be, of that's their outlet, and they need to find a better way to do that.
Well, and that's where I'd say, too, along that line, if they can't have a conversation without saying something profane or offensive,
or deflecting.
Right. Then I also think that's a sign of, okay, we need to talk about this, because the reality is, when they grow up and get into a job, you can't just talk like that all the time.
Yeah.
And so maybe even putting that in context of every now and then, I don't know, with your friends, if you're playing a sport, I'm not saying that I love that, But that is different than you're talking to a teenager, and we cannot have a single conversation without me going, you shouldn't say that.
And I think, like, too, from, like, a parent or, like, teacher perspective, it's like, can I provide a reasoning to the student, right? Like, going back to Tobin's point of, like, is this a battle worth, like, having right now? I think there's times where, like, if you can explain to them, like, if they're cussing a lot, and, like, teens need a reason. Why should I not? Like, why should I care not to cuss or not to talk this way? If you give them, like, whenever you start to apply for jobs, whenever you enter the business world, like, you can't just talk this way, or you're never going to get a job if you're in an interview, things like that. And so I think choosing the battles and then being able to provide through conversation, like, a reason why they should care. But I also think there's, like, ways as adults that your reaction can actually help feed the problem. Like we talked about earlier, if you're overreacting, if you're giving a big reaction, then that's feeding or teaching them, oh, okay, I get a reaction whenever I say this. If you're correcting in public, that's embarrassing. That's not really going to help much. Like,
does it help? Yeah. Very rarely does the public correction go the way that you think it will.
I think you can swing the pendulum too far the other way and just laugh it off. Like when students are testing you, I think sometimes they're testing you, okay, are they going to overreact? I think they're also testing, like, are you going to laugh? And then if that happens, and I had noticed this a lot of times as a student minister, because whenever I first started, like, I wanted to be cool. I wanted the kids to like me. And so it's like, if they're crossing a boundary or towing a line and you're laughing, then that's reinforcement. Okay, I can go further. I can go further.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's a balance of, like, having a shock-proof reaction, and then also just whenever a time needs to happen to have a conversation, have that conversation. But also don't swing the pendulum too far the other way. Like, yeah, there's no boundaries here. And then teach them that some things are good.
Right.
Some boundaries.
And this may be unpopular, and y'all might not even agree with me, but I think it also depends on their age too.
Yeah.
I think they're, like, obviously in a perfect world, you don't want them to do any of this stuff, and you don't want them to ever do it around you as a parent or a teacher, whatever it may be. But there is an age difference of, like, if my 16-year-old kid is saying something that I catch him in the process of, like, it's not great, but I can handle that differently than if my first grader is dropping F-bombs in the living room. That's a whole lot different story. And so I think that does play into it as well. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So some of the ways that we can talk about this and how we can correct it without, like, shaming or escalating it is, we kind of said this already, but we correct it calmly and not publicly. I mean, one of the things that teens hate the most is whenever you shame them publicly, or even if you're not trying to, but they take it as shame. Well, the thing I hear almost 9 times out of 10 when kids are angry is, well, they're not, they got to respect me. They don't respect me. And that is a version of that in their eyes, is that you don't respect them if you're shaming them publicly. So, like, address the impact, not just, like, the rule. Like, don't just say, hey, don't cuss. Like address why that comment could hurt someone. Let's talk about it. And then separating intent from, like, what they're trying to do, from the impact of what they're trying to do. Because, like, they'll obviously, a lot of times teens will follow up with, well, no, I was just joking. It's fine. It's just a joke. It's just a joke. But, like, they're too young to understand that even through jokes, like, that can be intent, that can have an intent to harm.
Yeah.
And so, and that impact still matters. So help them kind of learn how to build that empathy instead of being defensive about it. Because that's just one way that'll super help them in the future.
We talked about a little before we started recording, sometimes they might not understand even fully what they're saying or the context behind that of, I said this because it got a reaction, and we're sitting there going, well, if we know what it is, being like, hey, let me describe why this is very offensive and how that could be very hurtful to someone. Because at some point, uneducation isn't an excuse if you go say something at school and it is, like, incredibly racist or incredibly offensive, and then you're going, well, I didn't know. Okay, then don't say it. Let's have a conversation about making sure we're aware of what we're saying. Or if, as an adult, you're hearing something said over and over again, I'm going to use a silly example. 6, 7, I'm going, I have no idea what that means. Is that inappropriate? I don't know. So I went and looked it up. It wasn't. And so, but I think as an adult, it also would have been easy for me when my second graders started saying that to go, don't say that. Why are you saying that? And it wasn't even inappropriate. So sometimes we also need to educate ourselves on, is this actually what I think it is, or am I making an assumption because I just don't like the way that it sounds? Yeah. And so having an awareness, but having the type of relationship with a teenager where you can have this conversation and it's just, hey, I just want to know what do you mean by that? Yeah. Why is that the word that you chose? And let's talk about it.
Yeah, and it's not attacking. I can think of a couple of times where my mom had a conversation with me. The first one was like in middle school, and I wasn't even being inappropriate. I was just talking too much. I was just making jokes too often. And like I would drive teachers crazy. They're supposed to be teaching, and like I'm yapping, right? And like I remember my mom pulling me aside and she's like, "Caleb, like you are funny." Like, thank you. Like, yeah, thank you. I know. And she's like, "But you're not. It's not funny when you overuse it." And like it was just like advice that I think stuck with me of just like, yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. And she was like, think of someone that you think is funny, but is like just trying all the time to be funny. I'm like, yeah, that is annoying. It's just like, you're being annoying in a sweet, kind way. And that had an impact on me as a middle schooler. And then there was also a time, this is kind of embarrassing because I was an adult. I had just started at the church and I'm doing welcome. And my mom and dad would watch to see like if I was going to do a welcome or a communion thought. Like I was doing a welcome and communion thought, and for whatever reason, like I'm nervous and I just fall back to words that I know and used. And so I said sucks, which is like,
it's not a tier one word,
no,
but
it's not a word that you should be using on church from stage.
Sure.
So I got a call from my mom. Said, Caleb, you cannot say that from stage. And it's this lesson that's like, hey, yeah, I mean those words that, if they're a common part of your vocab in those moments, whenever
they will leak out,
out. And I think it's a good lesson, but that starts with having that relationship and it starts with choosing your battles. And then I think it also starts with asking the questions, right? And I think asking them in a non-confronting way of just like, hey, what did you mean by that? What reaction were you hoping to get? And then having the conversation from there to kind of help the teens process, okay, yeah, what was I trying to communicate through what I was saying?
And if you're a teen listening or a parent of a teen or whatever, whoever, but this is also like we talked about how they don't really know what they're doing and stuff like that. But also, yes, saying it out loud is not great, but they also think about what you're putting on social media, what you're typing out. I've seen so many examples. In fact, one this week of this group of teens in California using that you made a slur out of their shirts they were wearing, and now they thought it was a joke, and I mean whatever. It's not my job to figure out if they know the seriousness of it, but because of that decision, they are all basically going to have consequences on their senior year where they don't get to walk. Maybe one girl is like losing a scholarship to her university. Like you may think it's not a big deal, but just kind of be aware of the words you say like carry weight, whether you want to believe that or not, and so just kind of be careful with what you're doing, especially in that regard. But, and yeah, like just think about, I think the last thing we'll say is just think about how do you want people to experience you? If you're known as the guy that's constantly making inappropriate jokes or dropping the F-bombs or whatever, like, is that really the person that you want to be known as, like as a 16-year-old? And when you're 30 and you run into a high school kid and you're, some bigwig in a business firm, but they know you as the F-bomb guy. Like that's not right. It's not great, man. Yeah. Like, and so just kind of remember that, like, that there is some weight to what you say for sure.
Well, I think asking questions and being curious is just always a better way to handle teenagers and handle this. I can remember maybe last year, my son made a joke and it was a first grade potty joke, but he thought it was funny because I'm sure it would have gotten lots of laughs.
Yeah, I would have
with his friends.
Crushed in
the context he said it in, everyone just stopped and like looked at him. And then later I had the conversation. I was like, did that go how you thought it was going to go? And he was like, no, he was so embarrassed. But I was like, I want to have this conversation now because I don't want you to get like, that is a skill to know, is this appropriate or not with the setting that I'm in? Because I was like, I don't want you to get to school and say something to a teacher and you be so embarrassed because they're like, that's inappropriate. Why did you do that and react a certain way? Right. So I do think there's a balance between not cracking down on every single thing. You've got to kind of know where your line is, but also not letting teenagers get away with things that you're like, in another setting, that could be so bad. Like you cannot do that. For me, you choose your own line. For me, it does come down to, is this harming another person?
Yeah.
There's a difference between saying a word in a story in calling someone something
Sure.
or using a slur or telling an inappropriate joke about someone else that if it gets back to them, that is a bigger deal. So I think for our teachers listening especially, I know that you're hearing this in your class.
Mhm.
I know you're hearing it on your team. My husband's a basketball coach. The amount of things that I hear or see coming from the court, you can't monitor it all. But I do think it's also a conversation that's worth having in a respectful way and in a way that hopefully is asking questions and getting them to come to that realization themselves.
Yeah, and process it and just say like, what is this communicating? Because teens aren't thinking through that.
No.
And I think, if we can go alongside them and say like, all right, like, let's think through it. Like, what is this communicating to those around you? What would this be communicating outside of this context that you're in? Like, it may communicate one thing in this setting, but be careful. And I think those are valuable conversations to have. But here at Teen Life, like, our job is to help support teens and to support those who are supporting teens. And so thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, I don't know what apps you're using, but subscribe so that way you know what we're putting out there. But again, thank you so much for listening.